Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the First Parish in Lincoln. Welcome to you if you are squeezing into our 19th century pews. Welcome if you are watching online with us this afternoon. I know many are. My name is Nate Klug, and I'm one of the ministers here, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce this afternoon this near homecoming with Bill McKibben. First, I need to thank some of our wonderful leaders and committee members for dreaming up this event months ago and making it possible today. Thanks to our racial justice advocates, our outreach team, our green team, and a shout out to our partners at Metro West Climate Solutions as well. A few other logistics to get out of the way. We have restrooms which are right through those doors and to the left down the hall. Bill is going to talk this afternoon for refreshments through these doors, so please stick around if you're able. Every week at First Parish, we conclude our Sunday worship with two aspirations: to affirm each person's dignity and to cherish the living earth. More and more, I think we're understanding how these two goals are interconnected, inseparable, really, and that intersectional thinking is one of the many things that's appealing about Bill McKibben's latest book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Bill needs no grand introduction. His work, his books, his activism have been reaching folks all over the world for decades. I remember reading the anthology American Earth when I was in divinity school, and then hearing from a close friend how he was arrested with Bill that very month in a protest. And I highly recommend to you Bill's newsletter on Substack. Last week he offered a really provocative and, to me, delightful take on artificial intelligence and chatbots. But it's especially exciting, I think, to welcome Bill McKibben here to the town of Lincoln, where with our station wagons, today Bill will be focusing specifically on themes of housing and race, but I know that whatever he has to say, we will all come away feeling energized. And this is a great reminder to shut off those phones. Yeah. Let's go ahead and do that for a second. No problem. As I was saying, I know we'll all come away feeling energized, feeling challenged, and feeling a little less alone and a little more together in facing what we have to face. So please join me in offering a hearty welcome to Bill McKibben.
Well, what a pleasure to be here on a beautiful day and to be in this lofty pulpit. It's nice to be well above contradiction in this place, and an extraordinary pleasure, of course, to have my mom here with me. It's a special pleasure because we lived for many, many, many years in Lexington, but almost in Lincoln, right almost on the Lincoln line. When I was a boy, we used to, I don't know if anybody else will remember this place, but we used to ride our bikes up to, there was a farm stand called Lawson's up on Route 2 that was quite wonderful. And you'd stop at the Cambridge Res and fish for a little while on the way, and then go on up and buy some candy and talk to the llama that lived in the back of Lawson's. And Yale Divinity School, of all places, talking with remarkable students there who are learning to do terrific things and thinking a lot about the intergenerational work as well at the moment. All these things will factor into my talk today. But I do want to go back to the place where I began this book, which was in Lexington in 1970 and 1971, when we had just moved there. And, this was at the moment when suburbanization in America was at its absolute zenith. The previous 2 decades had seen almost all the growth in America come in those suburbs. We built a new landform almost, as it were, and it was a time of some turmoil, but of some optimism and as well. And the book begins with 2 events that happened a few weeks apart, one of which I knew about at the time, and one of which I didn't really, because I was only 10 or 11, so I wasn't paying that much attention. But the first event was so dramatic that one couldn't have missed it. This was at the height of the protests over the war in Vietnam. And the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, led by a then young, lanky, handsome, charismatic John Kerry, recently returned from his work as a lieutenant in Vietnam, wanted to bivouac on the Green in Lexington as part of their protest against the war. And the town fathers, and they were, I think, mostly fathers in those days, refused to let them do so and told them they would be arrested if they did. And so several hundred townspeople in Lexington just decided to sit there with them that night and get hauled away to jail, including my father. It was somewhat out of character for him. He was a business reporter, not the sort of thing he would have normally done, but it was very much of the moment, and of course it made a deep and powerful impact on the country in precisely the right direction, in the direction of peace and of civil rights and of equality for more and more kinds of people, and so on and so forth. It seemed a continuation of the thing that had started perhaps with FDR and the New Deal and lasted through the war, and then the years afterwards, of the sense that America was engaged, for all the contention that it involved, in a group project about making the country and the world a better place. LBJ called it the Great Society. Dr. King called it the beloved community, but there was some hope that this was our goal, and that seemed of a piece with it and struck my 10-year-old self very much as a kind of beacon for what I could expect of the future going forward. So when I started to research that in order to do a little writing about it, when I went back to look at the archives of the Minuteman newspaper, which someone had happily digitized, I was reading all those stories and then noticing that at the same time there was another big story happening simultaneously in Lexington. And that story was the story of the first attempt to have any kind of large-scale affordable housing. Not that large scale, it must be said, 100 units of affordable multifamily housing to be built in Lexington. And the backstory was interesting. Dr. King had come to speak at the high school sometime in the mid-1960s, and of course he'd been rapturously received. Thousands upon thousands of people gathered in the high school auditorium and outside to greet him and so on. And in the wake of that, the leading citizens of Lexington to take on their new responsibilities. And chief among them, they understood, was to try and do something to integrate racially and economically the town where they lived. And they came forward with this first plan for a multifamily housing complex because, of course, they understood, as anyone would, that the reason that people who weren't affluent couldn't move to Lexington was because if everyone's gonna have to live in a single-family house with its own driveway and its own backyard and on and on and on, that's gonna be expensive, They came up with this plan, and all the leading lights got behind it. The Planning Commission passed it. Every local pastor came out in favor of it. It even passed town meeting, and by a healthy margin. But Lexington has a representative town meeting. I assume, I don't know, does Lincoln also have representative town meeting? Or Lincoln has a old-fashioned town meeting like we have in Vermont. Well, Lexington didn't, and so people wanted to take that vote from town meeting to a referendum in the town. And they did. And a few weeks after that scene on the green, though every institution in town had supported this multifamily housing project, it was voted down 2-1 by people in the privacy of the voting booth. It wasn't even close. And to me, that marked the other strain in American society, the privatized strain of our world that was not thinking about America as a group project where we would make a better place, but instead was fixated on property values and on and on. And I think looking back, the ensuing decade back has sort of fought it out in certain ways. And by the end of the decade, one of those ideas had routed the other one. 1978 in California, they passed Proposition 13, the famous tax revolt. And 2 years later, on the same night, Massachusetts passed its own version, Prop 2.5, and then the country elected Ronald Reagan. Lexington voted for Ronald Reagan. And the other idea about the world won out. It was Reagan who said quite explicitly that there was no longer going to be a kind of group project. Government was the problem, he said, not the solution. It was his pal Maggie Thatcher who said, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And that approach to the world has more or less dominated our political life for the succeeding 40 years, reaching its reductio ad absurdum in President Trump, but by no means confined to him. When Barack Obama left office, someone interviewed him and said, you know, you had 60 Democratic senators when you took office. How come you got so little done? And he said, we were still constrained by the ideological revolution that Reagan had fought and won, the idea that government wasn't really supposed to do much. And truthfully, it's pretty moving right at the moment, though I'm annoyed with him for all kinds of things, especially this big new Willow oil complex in Alaska. It is moving to watch Biden try a little bit to take us back, not to the Obama years and not to the Clinton years, but sort of to the LBJ years. The Inflation Reduction Act is the climate bill is the first attempt really to put the full power of the government at work to try and address a grave problem. In this case, the energy transition. And it's imperfect and hobbled in many ways by the hangover. But that decade and the choices that we made, and then the subsequent living out of those choices, explain a lot to do. And we can talk about them in many different veins. I'll talk for a minute about housing and race, and then I will talk a little about carbon and the environment. This country is going finally through some kind of reckoning with its racial past. It's doing it in painful ways after the horrific scenes around George Floyd and the like. But part of what's happening is a belated recognition of the fact that those choices we made 40 and 50 years ago set us up for the incredible gulfs of inequality that now exist. So the biggest source of wealth in this country by far was what happened with that rapid suburbanization. If you were lucky enough to be in somewhere near the ground floor of that, then through no effort of your own, you've done very well over the last half century. My parents were smart enough to buy a house on halfway down a street called Middle Street, and it was about as middle as it was possible to imagine. As I say in the book, it looked like a child's drawing of a house, a sort of box with one big window on the first floor and two windows on the upper floor for my brother's bedroom and mine, and a tree out front and a driveway. The middle of that house cost $30,000 a route in 1970, and when it was sold a year ago or so, by a couple of owners later, it was worth $1 million. So in real terms, it went from the equivalent of about $200,000 in today's dollars to about $1 million. And that $800,000 was basically just explained by this kind of escalator that you happened to be on if you were lucky enough to have gotten in on the ground floor. Now, I will quickly add, and this is sort of the other part of the story having something to do with carbon, having paid $1 million for it, the new owners immediately tore it down and erected in its place something that looks like a hybrid between a junior high school and a medium security prison unit. But even without that, the point is that if you couldn't come up with $30,000 in 1970, then you missed out on all of that. And it's no accident that most black people in this country couldn't come up with $30,000 in 1970 because 200 years of government policy of all kinds had made sure that that wasn't possible. If you go back and look even at the things that I've been describing as part of this group project, when we passed, say, Social Security in this country, the categories that we excluded from coverage were the two categories where black people were most likely to be found: farmers and domestic workers. They were the ones excluded from Social Security, which helps explain why black people in America have to spend, and have had for generations, to spend a lot more of their income supporting their parents than other people have, and one could list things like this all day, from de jure to de facto housing segregation policies in place after place after place. Lexington had congratulated itself in 1964 or 65 after Dr. King's visit by possible to overcome the, and as I say, given the choice in that referendum in 1971, people chose quite clearly not to. They did not want to take that on. Not smaller than it was 50 years ago. That's remarkable to think about. And basically, it reflects the fact that there very few black people were on that escalator that, just carried people straight up. Which means that if one were serious about redressing that and paying that debt, that we really should get down to it in a variety of ways. And some of those ways are straightforward reparations, some way to redress that economic imbalance. That's politically difficult and unlikely, at least at the moment, at least at a federal level. But closer to home, it's completely possible to imagine going back finally and doing that work that we should have done 50 years ago and figuring out how to make sure that housing years ago. This was 50 years ago, which, to just judge from my quick assessment of the demographics of this audience, includes at least a couple of the other people in here. A subject, again, to which I'll return in a moment. So then let's talk about the other thing that happened and go back to the question of those people who were here and how they were living and what that was like. You know, people were already fairly affluent in 1970 by any kind of world standard, anyway, and fine, with, for people who lived in places like Lexington or Lincoln, had more than enough of what they needed. But of course, that didn't stop us from going on over the succeeding 50 years to build cartoonishly large houses like the ones I've described, or to take a station wagon, which was already a fairly large vehicle, and replace it with the fleet of semi-military machinery that we've employed for the last 3 or 4 decades to move our stuff around, and so on and so forth. Taken all together, that suburbanization of America produced the single largest puff of carbon in the atmosphere. Second largest puff came from the industrialization of China, which at least had the benefit of pulling a lot of people out of poverty as it did it. But ours was more a kind of luxury puff of carbon that we sent into the atmosphere. And it's truly enormous. There are about 3% of the world's population lives in America, but we've produced about 25% of all the carbon that's in the atmosphere. And we've done it over precisely this period of time. And it's, of course, just absolutely intimately linked to that automobile lifestyle that the suburbs built, celebrated, demanded. And the carbon that we put in there is still up there and will be for a long time. So even if you're driving an electric vehicle now, like I have, it doesn't absolve you of it. The carbon that came out of the back of our family's maroon Plymouth Fury, while I was getting my learner's permit in the age of 15, that carbon dioxide is still up there in the atmosphere trapping heat. That's how it works, And so when we look around the world, and see the incredible damage that's all now wreaking, we do need to understand just how intimately it's connected to us and to the places where we came from. I mean, Pakistan had the worst flooding that the world has seen since Noah last fall. Flooding on a scale it's almost impossible to imagine. It started raining and it didn't stop for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. There were parts of the provinces of Sindh or Balochistan that got 800% of their annual rainfall in the course of 2 weeks. So, I mean, there's no place on earth that can stand up to that. A lot of the housing in that part of the world is, dried mud housing, and it works fine. It's good building substance until it rains like that, and then people's houses just literally melted away around them. 33 million Pakistanis were displaced. That's the equivalent of everybody from Boston to Baltimore out of their homes, Taken together, the 200 million people in Pakistan have put well less than 1% of the carbon that's in the atmosphere. So not their fault. I just published a little piece in that newsletter this morning about pointing out that Donald Trump's arrest was not, in fact, the most important news story of the week. The most important news story of the week came from the Antarctic, where research happened the same day, so nobody covered it. There wasn't even a story in the Times, but a dismal paper showing that the rapid melt of ice in the Antarctic has poured enough fresh water into the Southern Ocean that it's begun to rapidly degrade the great overturning current that moves nutrients around the world's oceans, and that it may be degraded by 40% by 2050. At which point, damage on that scale affects all of us in perhaps truly desperate ways. But for the moment, the people who get hurt first and hardest are the people who did the least to cause this problem and to whom we owe a good deal. The U.S., like other countries, signed on last fall to a loss and damage fund at the climate talks in Egypt that's supposed to begin compensating countries in the global south for the damage that they're suffering but that they didn't cause. There's probably no amount of money capable of compensating people. Somalia has now had its 5th rainy season in a row with no rain. There are tens of millions of people literally on the edge of starvation, kept alive by a little bit of food aid trickling in from the outside world, but that's it. But not only is there not enough money to compensate people, even if we were serious about it, in fact, there's no money at all in that fund. Nobody, having set it up, no one's put any money in it. And one I think is granted a little skepticism about the chances that Kevin McCarthy will decide that it's an important use of our government's money to compensate reparations for African suffering from climate change seems truthfully somewhat far-fetched. So, and I'm rattling on here and getting close to the end of time I'm supposed to talk. Let me try and suggest just a few of the ways that we might try and start paying some of these debts a little better, and who should be paying them. They're not debts that can be paid individually in any significant way. Individual actions that we can take are good to take. And so buying an electric car or eating a vegan dinner or whatever it is are good things to do for many reasons, and we should do them. But do not expect them by themselves to begin to make up the whole that we are in. They really represent, in a sense, the elevation of that somewhat Reaganized thinking about the fact that individuals, not societies and not power structures, are the center of things. Our job instead is to figure out again how to recapture some of that sense of solidarity, of joint purpose, and put it to work. And one of the most interesting questions really is whose job it is to do that. I've spent most of my life organizing around climate change. It's not really my work. I've never been paid for it, but I'm a writer for most of my time for a number of years. And most of the time I've been doing that, it's been with artists, and it's been with young people who have a very strong sense of the narrowing and constricting of their own life chances because of what's coming down the pike at them. When I helped start 350.org, which was the first effort at a big global climate campaign. I started it with 7 college students, and they were wonderful. And they found lots and lots of other young people all over the world to join in with them. One of the things we did was run this huge fossil fuel divestment campaign to get institutions of all kinds to sell their stock in coal and oil and gas. A lot of that work was carried out on college campuses across the country, and young people did an amazing job of forcing everybody, even Harvard eventually, to change its investment patterns and things. Took a lot of work. Those kids were great. When they got out of school, they wanted to keep working on this, and so they formed this thing, the Sunrise Movement, that brought us the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal and the work they did to popularize it was the reason that we got this Inflation Reduction Act out of Congress last year. That was the seed of it. The young people had asked for $30 trillion, which was probably a reasonable sum. It ended up being about $300 billion, which is still far more than we'd ever spent, but it's a good reminder that if you want something, ask for 100 times more than you think you might get in the end and bargain down from there. But they were fantastic. And then, of course, there were the much younger people, exemplified by Greta Thunberg, who stood up too. Greta's one of my favorite people on earth. There's no one I like working with more. I adore her. And she'd be the first to say there are 10,000 Greta Thunbergs around the planet, and there really are. And I've met 4,000 or 5,000 of them, I think. I did a book launch on Thursday night for one of her German counterparts, a wonderful young woman named Louisa Neubauer. And, they're just all over the world. And they have 10 million followers. That's how many kids were out on climate strike in September of 20 generation to solve these problems, which seems ignoble, but it also seems very impractical. Young people have energy, intelligence, idealism to burn, but what they lack is structural power to make rapid change of the scale that we need. So, it's worth asking who possesses that structural power. And one of the answers, anyway, is people like me who are nearer the, how would you put it, nearer the exit than the entrance. There are 70 million people over the age of 60 in the United States. That's a lot. That's more than the population of France, okay? And multiply it by some factor, because we all vote. There's no known way to stop old people from voting. And we ended up with most of the money. It's about 70% of the country's financial resources are in the hands of the boomers or the silent generation above them. May not be fair, it is real, and it means that if you wanted to push around Washington or Beacon Hill or Wall Street or anybody else, having some people with hairlines like mine would be useful. And so we've begun to try and organize in that way. In the last year or so, we set up this thing called Third Act. That's political scientists is that people become more conservative as they age. But we can't let that be true, and I think it need not be true. It be true at least for this generation of older people. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s or 90s now, in your first act, you were around to either participate in or bear economic transformation, the heart of this group project of trying to make a better place. You were around for the moment when we started taking women seriously in the public life. You were around for the apex of the civil rights movement. You may have marched on the first Earth Day in 1970. If you have any doubt about the power of those days, look at what the retrograde Supreme Court went after last summer when it went on its rampage. It went after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1970, and Roe v. Wade 1973. So, having won those battles once, we need to win them again and win some others, and that's what we're trying to do. Our work at Third Act last year focused a lot on trying to overcome some of the racialized voter suppression stuff underway around the country. Trying to register lots of voters, trying to ensure that the right wing didn't gain control of the Senate, so on and so forth. And it was powerful and interesting work to get to do, and people proved very adept at it. We had a lot of things that we were doing. I mean, most of it was just writing, thousands of, hundreds of thousands of email. Managed to register for the first election in which they're eligible. And it was very moving for the people who got to do it and think about their own lives, and very moving for a lot of the kids who got them. It turns out that if you're 17 in this world, the odds that you've actually received a letter from anyone in a very long time are very low. You've received a billion Snapchats and TikToks and so on and so forth, but a letter and the ability to write one is a superpower that belongs to a certain generation. And then this year, with the brief elections, all too brief, we've been hard at the climate crisis, and doing it in this case, since I don't think we're going to get any more federal legislation anytime soon. Third Act chapters across the country have been working in local and state governments and stuff, but we also decided to go after the 4 big banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that are the 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry. If you have cash sitting in the mainstream banking system, it produces a lot of carbon. If you have 125 grand in the bank, it produces more carbon as it gets lent out for pipelines and fracking wells and stuff than all the cooking, driving, heating, flying, cooling that the average American does in the course of a year. $5,000 in one of those banks produces more carbon than flying back and forth across the country. So we've been pushing them, and it culminated about 10 days ago when, as some of you I'm very thankful, helped out with, we had this big day of action across the country where we had more than 102 demonstrations out in big and small all over the country outside these banks. And there were beautiful pictures from Bedford and Lexington and elsewhere in Boston of people doing this. I was in DC for the day, and it was fantastic. We really leaned into the older person thing, and we locked down, we cleaned them with rocking chairs. It was great fun. It was the most comfortable sit-in I've ever done. And it very much worked. There was big coverage in the Times and the Post and NPR and things. And, we've begun to, we've had a long conversation with, senior executives at the top of one of those 4 banks already. They're not going to change immediately, but we need to press them to shift and shift hard. All I'm trying to say is that it's going to take at least some of this kind of solidarity to have some hope of beginning to pay off some of the debts that we very much owe. And that kind of solidarity, that kind of organizing requires joining together with others. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make a difference. With others in movements large, amazing work. And if you're over 60, Third Act's probably, we're actually having the sort of launch call for Third Act Massachusetts in a few weeks, the statewide version of this. And I was just talking with the wonderful Gina McCarthy today, who's our climate czar for the first 2 years of the Biden administration, is going to join us on the call and help welcome people in. I guess I'm trying to say that we've gotten to live extremely great ocean currents are starting to slow and then stop. That's what it means when half the sea ice in the summer Arctic is melted, or when Pakistan is enduring floods of the scale that it's seen, or on and on and on. Being outside your comfort zone will mean different things to different people. In sometimes, for me, oddly, maybe not so oddly, maybe just following the example of my father, it's ended up meaning going to jail over and over and over again. And that's actually something that older people could be quite good at. When we did the first demonstrations against the Keystone Pipeline in Washington, which is still maybe the biggest victory we've managed to win over the oil industry, I wrote the letter that asked people to come to Washington and get arrested. And I said, I don't think kids should have to be the cannon fodder here. They're doing all the other work, but if you're 19, an arrest record might not be the best thing for your resume. One of the few unmixed blessings of growing older is, past a certain point, what the hell are they going to do to you, And so, we didn't ask people as they were getting arrested in this country in many years. 1,200 and some people went to jail. We didn't ask them as how old are you as they were getting arrested, because that seemed a little rude. But we did say, who was president when you were born? And the two biggest cohorts were from the FDR and the Truman administrations. And what was really good was that the young people there, out of your comfort zone, and my prediction is that if you get out of it, you will find that there's a certain amount of real joy and pleasure in it, which is strange. You would think that the real joy and pleasure would lie elsewhere, but I don't know if anybody else has ever seen those bumper stickers that you see on the back of Winnebagos sometime or something that says, "I'm spending my kid's inheritance." It's entirely true. That is what we've been doing as a generation. And it's not as much fun, not as human as the work of trying to do the opposite, of trying to defend their inheritance, trying to figure out how we don't become the first generations to leave the world a much worse place than we found it. So that's what we're about. And it's interesting thinking back on all that history, but it's only interesting and only worth doing if you plan on trying to do something about it in the meantime. So that's why I hope that you'll figure out, I'm sure many of you already have, and for that, enormous thanks, and enormous thanks also for what you will do in the time ahead. And thank you for being here today. I made a liar of you, Nate, and went way past my 40 minutes, for which apologies. But I'm happy to stay and grapple with stuff. So.
Great. Bill, thank you so much. I know you have a busy schedule and you're speaking in Concord tonight, so we're so grateful again for making time. And we do have some time for questions now. If you're watching online and you'd like to ask a question, you can message Sarah Klakowski, who is on Altar Live as well as with us here. Is that right, Sarah? So send a message to Sarah if you have a question for her. Actually, it would probably be a question for Bill. And let's get started with a few questions from folks. Just raise your hand and Mary Helen, do you want to grab the other microphone and we'll make our way around. I see one question down there that we can start with. Oh, we'll have you speak into the mic.
Then the people can hear you at other places. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Press the button.
Thank you. Okay. That was wonderful. I found it most invigorating. It came for me at a special time. I think being in those years where I marched and I saw so many good changes, I feel in such pain about my grandchildren and the world that will be for them. So I used to always wake up and listen to NPR in the morning, and I'm starting to find it too painful, so that I have to find a way, to keep hope alive,
Mm-hmm.
because hope is what we got. And I think you brought a number of examples of hope to us, and certainly in the form of young people. But I think the gatherings are so important. And if there are any other words of advice, or I think you might have already done it.
It's a very good question, and I agree. So much of it hits home. I can't really listen to the radio anymore either, and it sort of started when Trump took over, and just like I did not want to hear his voice by surprise. It was just like so I read now, and I can sort of control it a little.
Play Wordle.
But yes, there are. Figuring out how to start taking action on things is really fun, and there are great. But so the easiest, I noticed a couple of people with signs about it outside as we were coming in. Here's a easy project that to defeat, and an important one. But I can't imagine that it's not going to go down to defeat if people just do a little bit of defeat, if people just do a little bit of work, because it's so preposterous. Expand to become solely to take care of people flying private jets in 2023 is just literally, they might as well just rename it carbon dioxide field, that is the most ludicrous extension of this privatized world. Flying in and of itself is not a great thing for the world around us, and we should be doing less of it. But at the very least, if you have to do it, be willing to do it with another 75 people at the same time, so there's some economy of scale. The idea that we would need to have a special airport just to have people who can't be bothered to be with other people in their airplane is how people will understand that, if there are people to understand it 100 years hence, is beyond belief. So I'm very glad that there are people organizing about that. And it, as I say, I think it should be a relatively easy fight, so a good place to learn how to do some of this work, and to get a good early victory along the way, because that one's just preposterous, gotta say. Do you want me to? You guys figure out who I see. There's a hand over there. Wherever you.
Sarah, why don't you read that question, and I'll move over to them.
We got a question from the live stream. Is it too late to stop the Willow oil field project in Alaska?
It's a good question. The Willow project is this vast oil complex that the Biden administration just green-lighted. I just interviewed John Podesta about it for the New Yorker. They'll be out in a few weeks. And they claim that they had no choice, but they would get sued if they didn't and stuff. I don't think that's true. I think it was basically a deal with the Alaska congressional delegation. And I really do think it was ludicrous. I've told you I admire much that Biden has done, but this is typical example of politicians never being willing to say no to anything. Biden was willing to say yes around spending a lot of money on electric vehicles and so on and so forth, and that's good. But you also have to be willing to say no to the excesses of the fossil fuel industry, which is the sort of biggest kind of law firm for the environment, has filed a set of suits that'll try and slow things down. But lawsuits always work better when there's a big movement behind them. There's petitions circulating at the moment. If you go to stop. I'm not going to forget it. Well, I'm not going to forget in my new newsletter. So if you go look it up, the newsletter is called The Crucial Years. You can see, and one of the things I do in there is just try and keep everybody up to date on what the various fights are. And so the petition is linked in there. But it's a good thing to keep talking to your Congress people about. Ed Markey has been truly great on all these things right through, and provided real leadership, so bolster him some in this fight. I got to say, it was one of the great moments in this intergenerational collaboration when very young people managed to figure out how to re-elect Ed Markey, not a very young person, to the U.S. Senate last time around, and it was great fun to watch them messing with the, up on TikTok, messing with the political system. Gave me great pleasure. So there you are.
Thanks, Steve.
Bill, thank you so much for holding a mirror up in front of us. It's a powerful thing to hear you speak. And just for the record, I too passed my driver's test in a Plymouth Fury, so really appreciate that, Colin. I haven't read your book yet, and I look forward to it. You've mentioned enough for me to see where the flag is and to see where the station wagon is.
Yeah.
Where's the cross, and what is the role of faith traditions in churches and synagogues to help us find a way forward?
That's a very good question. So the middle part of the book is sort of about the decline of mainline Protestantism in America, the tradition that I grew up in, that this church is part of, on and on. Mainline 1970, roughly 52% of Americans belong to one of the mainline Protestant churches. That number is now about 13%. It's been the biggest change in many ways in our civic life, because it went from being the center of gravity of that group project, as it were, and replaced in almost exactly the same time by a religious philosophy that matched the economic and political one pretty closely. Faith was no longer a group project. It became a project at best about individual salvation, and that was the point of it, which seems to me not to be the point of the gospel. You don't have to take me too seriously on this. I've never risen higher in the ecclesial hierarchy than Methodist Sunday school teacher, but it is a set of views that I hold powerfully, and it's one of the things that I was talking about at the Div School in Yale. An absolute, by the way, you could not have been in a place that was more a bulwark of that tradition. The room where we were holding the workshop was literally the room in which and there's pictures on the wall to prove it, where they assembled to write the Revised Standard Version of the Bible, the sort of, Protestant text of the 20th century. So there's a bunch of tasks for what remains of that church, it seems to me. And some of them are just to do this organizing, and people are doing a good job. There's wonderful groups like Green Faith, and the other task of the remnants of that older faith in places like this are simply to stand up for the idea that Christianity has nothing to do with what it's now depicted as. I don't know if probably some of you saw this survey data that indicated that now about a third of Americans fall into this category of white Christian nationalists, and 2/3 of the Republican Party falls into, and it is the most dangerous thing in the world. If you doubt it, look at what's happening with Hindu nationalism in India, Jewish fundamentalist nationalism in Israel, Orthodox nationalism in Russia, Islamic nationalism in Turkey, on and on and on. It's not impossible to imagine that at all in this country. In fact, the Supreme Court already seems to be a kind of fairly effective representation of it. There's lots of people who can stand up to that, but there's only one group who can stand up to it on the grounds that not only is it cruel, stupid, ill-advised, backward, repressive, but it's also not Christian in any sense of the word. The faith that animates this place is a faith about not about a king or a warrior, but about a baby who lived in opposition to empire, was advised people to give what they had to the poor, advised them to turn the other cheek, whose crime policy was, if someone steals your coat, give them your cloak also, on and on and on. We need our pastors, our bishops, our denominations saying loud and clear, if you read the Bible and come away thinking that you want an AK-47, then you've read the Bible wrong, and you are not a Christian in the sense that we understand it. And that would be a powerful witness to make and an important part of the political solution. So I think sometimes, though I deeply admire the mainline tradition that remains, it errs sometimes on the side of politeness in these discussions. And it has a unique role to play in being frank about just how not only wrong but unchristian. And I think that progressives made a big mistake in surrendering both the flag and the cross to the right, because I think both of them, though deeply tarnished, have powerful, radical values attached to them. I mean, the flag as well as the cross, the reason that John Kerry wanted to go bivouac on Lexington Green was because that was the first place in the world where people stood up to empire and said, here and no further.
Maybe one or two more, Bill?
Absolutely.
Bill, my name is Surendra. You talked about, demonstrating against the 4 banks for lending money to the fossil fuel companies. I think, have you done much work about asking the generations of 60 and over to look at their portfolios and how much of the debt that they are accepting is a way, as an investment vehicle? And are you doing anything about it to educate people to think critically how they can avoid having to invest in those bonds that oil and gas companies may issue?
Yes, there's a lot of work going on, not only around the banks, but around investment, asset managers, and insurance companies. I wrote a piece 3 or 4 years ago for the New Yorker with a somewhat lengthy title. It was something like, "Money is the oxygen on which the fires of global warming burn." And it was about all 3 of these categories. They're connected but somewhat separate. Banks, asset managers like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, insurance companies. And there's big campaigns about all of them, especially Liberty Mutual, since it's headquartered in Boston, and there's been some very good activism. The insurance industry is the absolute epitome of the craziness of the world in which we live. They're the biggest, by some measures, the single biggest industry on the planet. They're the people that we ask to understand risk in our society. They do understand risk. They have all the data to demonstrate precisely what's happening on the planet. And yet they're also the industry that continues to invest zillions of dollars in fossil fuel, and even more to underwrite all the new pipelines and frack wells and everything else that they could not be built without them. Every time I think about them, I'm reminded of that Leninist dictum that the capitalists will sell us the rope with which to hang them. I mean, there's just a kind of insane There's times when it feels as if our system is a kind of suicide pact, and that the insurance industry is the greatest example of it. So figuring out how to challenge all of those things is really important. I don't think, though we definitely help people move their money, and one of the features of last week's action was lots of people happily cutting up their credit cards, and it was great fun to watch. In Alaska, Juneau, they built big credit cards out of wood and then cut them up with solar-powered chainsaws. Though that was really fun. I don't think probably there's so much money in these places. Those 4 banks hold 50% of all the deposits in America. They're basically the capital in capitalism. And institutions to sell their stock in oil and gas companies over the last decade. It's been very successful. We're at about $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested. Our argument was mostly on moral grounds, but the people who did it early on made out like bandits because the oil industry deeply underperformed the rest of the economy for the last decade. It occurs to me occasionally that if I was, been raised in slightly different ways, I would have figured out how to take 1%, along the way, and then I could have my own junior high school / medium security prison, in which to live. But Mom failed me in which to live. But Mom failed me in that regard. So
I saw a question over here somewhere. Is that still relevant? Okay.
It'll be quick. Thank you so much for all your work, and you've been an inspiration to me over many, many years. For 10 years, I founded a very teeny nonprofit, and you were a big inspiration of that. I'm just wondering, is it too idealistic to imagine humanity ever becoming like a keystone species, one that are all learning how to be stewards and not destroyers through the unwitting, system of capitalism?
I don't think it's too idealistic to imagine it happening someday. But I think that and this is a very good place on which to end, it's just the right question. I don't think you and I are going to live long enough to see that transformation happen. So I think our job is to figure out how we get civilization through the deep bottleneck that it faces over the next 30, 40, 50 years. And I think if we manage somehow to get through that, then there are lots of possibilities for people to figure out how to live in more interesting ways than we've been living. And I think that there are possibilities for getting through that if we seize them. But one of the things that happened over the last 10 years was that engineers did their job, and the price of a solar panel and a wind turbine dropped by 90%. We now live on a world where the incredible change. It's not absolutely perfect because you have to mine lithium and whatever to make the system work, and it's not. But it's even on those counts, 1,000 times cleaner than the one we inhabit now. 1 death in 5 in this world comes from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. Anything to get off it. Even without the climate crisis that we face. So it's possible to imagine, a world in the not too distant future where humans stop setting things on fire, The problem is the speed with which things have to happen. Unlike the other political problems that we run up against, this is a timed test. And if we don't get it right in that time, then it won't matter. Winning slowly on climate change is just a different way of losing. And so our job is to do what we can to catalyze this process, to make it happen much faster than it otherwise would. And I think we can do it in the confidence that if we manage to do our part in that, then the quite extraordinary young people who are on this planet now and the generations that will follow them will figure out lots of good and interesting and lovely ways in which to live. And it would not surprise me at all if we manage to get through this, that people look back at our period and use it as a kind of example, sort of saying that we, kind of learned our lesson, And beautiful. We won't see it. Our job is to allow it to happen. Our job is to get us through this period so that the people who come after us have some fraction of the choices, options, possibilities that we had when we were young. Some tiny, they're not going to have lives as comfortable as the ones that we live, but some fraction of the margin that we had. And so that's our task now. And we don't know if we'll be successful or not, because the momentum of the system is very strong. That study this week from the Antarctic was a kick in the gut. But we do know that if we don't take all the action we can, then the outcome is foreordained. And we know that everything we do will reduce to one degree or another the risk and danger and trouble that those who come after us will have to deal with. So let's do those who come after us will have to deal with.
Friends, thank you so much for coming this afternoon. 2 quick plugs on ways to continue this conversation. Our friends at Metro West Climate Solutions are hosting a forum on April 11th about food, farming, and climate change. That's April 11th at 7 p.m., I believe. And then if you want to talk about Bill's book and just really continue talking about the things we've been talking about this afternoon, you'd be very welcome to join us here at First Parish for a book club. That's April 27th. It'll be on Zoom. There are flyers out there. And please stick around for refreshments right through these doors. Thanks again to Bill.